Golf, I want it to be open to all. So juniors, ladies, men, disability, all walks of life. I want it to be demystified as an elite sport. I want it to be a sport for all.
Another place that is embracing the new is the Karen Club, who are actively seeking young members.
We are coming from a place whereby we did not have children playing much golf. So we made a deliberate decision to change our bylaws a few years ago to allow children more access to the course.
These changes have had a noticeable impact.
We've doubled the number of our handicapped juniors in the last 2 years. So that is a big improvement. And we have a pool of 140 juniors who are playing golf. Something else that has happened is that there's a junior league that was started within Nairobi clubs for 2 years running. Find that a parent is a golfer and they introduce their kids to golf. We've seen the inverse happening. We have seen parents who are not in golf, but because of their kids speaking to other juniors, they've taken up golf. So the parents are actually bringing them to the course without necessarily them playing or even getting an interest to play. So which has helped create some vibrancy in the club, and also the level of patronization has gone up.
With all this talk of the positive impact that juniors are having, it makes sense to let one of them have the last word.
What I like about golf is the unity it brings to our community and the new friendship it brings. It also enlists integrity, and it also brings a sense of faith in one another, trusting the other person to tell you the right score or the right ruling instead of cheating their way around the system. And my long-term goal is to hopefully make it onto the LPGA tour and show that it doesn't matter your background or where you're from, you can still make it on tour, because I feel like on tour there's not much of Kenyan or African players, especially in the ladies section. I think people should pay close attention, because here in Kenya I see a lot of girls and especially boys also that show a great deal of maturity, and I think soon enough we can probably give other countries a run for their money, because in Kenyan golf you have not only a lot of long hitters, you also have people who are very good technically and physically.
Well, she looks like a very promising young player. And it's great to see youngsters, especially girls, playing such an active role in the development of the game.
Sadly, it's time to head home. But before we go, let us leave you with a little bit of music and some of the images that make Mauritius truly memorable. See you next time.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Michael Holmes. Appreciate your company. Coming up on CNN Newsroom, a growing list of countries suspend funding for the UN agency providing critically needed aid to Palestinians. Farmers across France block major highways and threaten a siege of Paris unless the government does more to improve their incomes and living conditions. Plus, why museums across the US are making a change to their Native American art displays.
Live from Atlanta, this is CNN Newsroom with Michael Holmes.
The United Nations Secretary General is asking countries not to suspend funding for the agency helping Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Now have a look at these 9 countries who paused funding for the UN Relief and Works Agency, also known as UNRWA, after accusations by Israel that a handful of UNRWA workers were involved in the October 7 attack. Israel has not publicly released its evidence. UNRWA took immediate action against the accused staffers and launched an investigation into the allegations. The UN says 9 were fired, 1 has died, and the identities of 2 others are being verified. UNRWA provides humanitarian aid and other services to the more than 2 million people in Gaza. In a statement released a few moments ago, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says, quote, "The abhorrent alleged acts of these staff members must have consequences, but the tens of thousands of men and women who work for UNRWA should not be penalised. The dire needs of the desperate populations they serve must be met." CNN international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson is in Tel Aviv with more on the allegations and the fallout.
Well, the situation is escalating. UNRWA has released a statement saying that their aid operation in Gaza may have to end. They say that they give life-saving support to more than 2 million people inside of Gaza. The head of UNRWA is calling for all those nations who are suspending funding right now to change their minds. The United States, the UK, Germany, Italy, Canada, Finland, Australia, to name but a few, have decided to suspend their funding for UNRWA because of the IDF's investigation that discovered some staff members of UNRWA, believed to be allegedly potentially 12, were involved in the brutal October 7th attacks of Hamas, that they joined Hamas in those in that operation. Now, the UNRWA moved very swiftly to fire the staff that were alleged and accused of this. However, the situation is developing whereby the IDF says they have more information from the intelligence directorate here in Israel that other UNRWA facilities have been used for terrorist operations by Hamas. They say they haven't made that evidence public, but they say that they have it. And Israel's foreign minister is saying that he wants the leadership of UNRWA essentially to pay a price. He's calling on other nations to join the suspension of funds for UNRWA, and also saying that he's going to work with international partners to end UNRWA's operations inside of Gaza. That could potentially really change the nature of how humanitarian aid gets into Gaza, is distributed in Gaza. And at the moment in Gaza, given the desperate plight of so many of the displaced people, close to 2 million displaced inside of Gaza, this would be a heavy blow if UNRWA's operations were suspended in some way. That's not clear that that's going to happen in the short term. But as this situation seems to escalate and the rhetoric around it escalates, it really is unclear at the moment what the outcome is going to be. Nick Robertson, CNN, Tel Aviv, Israel.
The need for aid is painfully clear in Khan Yunis's hospitals. According to the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health, the Nasser medical complex is running out of anaesthetics, other medications and blood for transfusions, a shortage the ministry spokesman calls, quote, severe and dangerous. Doctors Without Borders says the hospital's vital medical services have collapsed. The Israel Defense Forces said Friday they are carrying out what they called precise operations against Hamas in Khan Yunis, but Palestinian officials say in reality the hospitals themselves are under siege. Meanwhile, CNN's Jeremy Diamond has new footage of blindfolded Palestinian detainees being held by Israeli authorities.
Well, we were in southern Israel on Saturday morning near the border with Gaza when we spotted more than 24 men sitting or kneeling on the cold, wet ground, Israeli soldiers standing guard near them. Now, we now know that those men were Palestinians who were arrested by the Israeli military inside of Gaza and brought to Israel for questioning. Now, these men were blindfolded, they were barefoot, and if you look in this video, you can see their hands are tied behind their backs, and all they're wearing are these disposable white coveralls. Now, it's important to keep in mind that it was about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, and quite rainy when we filmed this video. And the men in this video seem to be physically exhausted. You can see them kind of swaying around, their heads bobbing as they seem to be falling asleep. One man was actually lying on the ground before an Israeli soldier came to rouse him and prop him up. Now, the Israeli military, for its part, said, quote, "The individuals shown on camera are suspected of terrorist activity and were arrested in Gaza and transferred to Israel for further interrogation. Relevant suspects are taken for further questioning within Israel. Individuals who are found not to be taking part in terrorist activities are released back into Gaza as soon as possible." Now, the Israeli military also addressed the condition in which we found these Palestinian detainees. They said that they were wearing these white coveralls because they had been stripped and searched to ensure that neither they nor their clothing had any explosive devices or weapons on them. And they said that they were about to be placed on a heated bus and taken to a detention facility where they would be provided with actual clothing. Now, we weren't able to verify exactly how long these men were sitting outside in the cold because an Israeli soldier came to us and directed us once he saw we were filming to leave the premises. Now, as it relates to this claim by Israel that these men are suspected of terrorist activity, it's important to note that while this is the first time that we have actually been able to directly document the detention of these Palestinian men from Gaza, there has been a lot of footage circulating from Gaza of Palestinian men being detained, and in many cases, those men actually turn out to be civilians. They are spotted by their relatives or their friends as civilians. And in December, we actually spoke with 10 Palestinian men and boys who had been detained by the Israeli military, held for 5 days, and ultimately released without charge. Now, these men and boys, all of them had swollen wrists, some of them bruises on their wrists from having their hands tied behind their backs for 5 days. Now, the Israeli military, for its part, maintains that it treats all of these detainees in accordance with international law. Jeremy Diamond, CNN, Tel Aviv.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is urging Qatar to tighten the screws on Hamas. When asked about a leaked audio recording that aired on Israeli TV on Tuesday in which he criticised the Gulf nation, calling it problematic, Mr. Netanyahu says he stands by those comments.
Qatar hosts the leaders of Hamas. It also funds Hamas. It has leverage over Hamas. Qatar committed to make sure that the medication will reach the districts of Hamas to our hostages, and Qatar said that it can help bring them back. So, therefore, to put pressure on them, they position themselves as mediators. So please, go right ahead and prove it. Let them be so good as to bring back our hostages.
Protesters in Israel, meanwhile, pleading for the world to remember the plight of the hostages and demand their release. Demonstrators marching in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem carrying Israeli flags and posters with photos of the more than 130 hostages still believed to be in Gaza. They say they're trying and failing to keep hope alive.
We're over 100 days into this tragedy. There was the period of shock and uncertainty, but with every passing day, unfortunately, we feel more and more despair. I feel more and more despair. We always hope that Hirsch and all of the hostages will come home, will come back to their families, will return to living the lives they wish to live. But with every passing day, I feel that we are abandoned.
The US says an oil tanker hit by a Houthi missile in the Gulf of Aden on Friday was carrying highly flammable cargo. Indian, French and American ships responded to the distress call and helped put out the fire on board. Crew members are reported to be okay, and the ship's operator says it is sailing towards a safe harbour. Despite continued warnings and strikes from the US, Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen continue to attack ships in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, saying it's in support of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Still to come on the program, French farmers pointing their tractors towards Paris, threatening a blockade of the city if they don't get their way. We'll look at why similar protests are playing out all across Europe. French farmers are taking to the streets quite literally. Lines of tractors blocking a major highway out of Paris recently. The farmers' grievances include the cost of fuel and competition from Ukrainian farms and produce. France is Europe's largest food producer, but other EU nations have seen similar demonstrations. And now the French farmers are threatening to use their tractors to barricade Paris on Monday. Cécile Auduit is a professor of French studies at Stanford University. She joins me now. Professor, thanks so much. We're talking about France, but as we said, there's been similar demonstrations by other European countries, Germany, Belgium, Romania, Poland. How broad-based are the concerns of farmers in France, but more broadly Europe?
Very wide, and the specificity of this movement is that it has popular support. And even in a strange way, the government's support in France, even though this movement is, issuing requests towards the government, there is a general sentiment of being fed up with the amount of norms, regulations, and the very hard working conditions leading to very poor salaries. And this is throughout Europe. With the import of Ukrainian product and meat, it has accelerated this notion that European workers are not defended by their own governments and yet pressured to produce cleaner food with more norms and without any support.
Yeah, with a lot more regulation. I mean, these protests within the agricultural sector in Europe, as we said, they're not new, of course. How much do these protests more broadly, I guess, shine a light on the bureaucratic nature of the EU and the difficulties in finding policies that will satisfy so many countries with perhaps different individual circumstances?
Yeah, so I mean, the complaint that the European Union has been a manufacturer of norms across sectors is not new. It's been proclaimed for decades, actually. What's new here is that there is an impulse with the Green New Deal to actually combat climate warming and reduce pollution. And it's the first time that agricultural conditions are targeted by a European-wide legislation. In the past, climate warming policies at the European Union level were regarding industries or the energy sector. And so now there is this sense that even though Europe is actually a huge agricultural power, they are imposing tons of norms and regulations. And the problem is not necessarily the norms themselves, but the fact that they are the only one to bear the brunt of it, while the European Union continues to import from other countries in South America or Ukraine, as you said.
Yeah. I mean, there was one farmer I was reading, he was quoted by Agence France-Presse, and he said, quote, they, meaning the politicians, sit in their leather seats in their heated or air-conditioned offices. They don't see the impact of all the decisions they make on us. How widespread is that view that the politicians just don't get it?
I think it's way further than just the agricultural sector's protests. As you know, you've noticed there is this wave of populist movements seizing on this unrest and dissatisfaction with the political elite, and this schism between the governing entities and the people who are hardworking and try to make ends meet. And with the rise of prices in the last 2 or 3 years, it has become unbearable for a lot more people.
Right. You touched on something there, and I'd like to ask you more about it. I mean, in Germany and France, to an extent, I guess Belgium, you know, it's reported that the political far right has in some ways co-opted the farmer concerns, particularly ahead of the European elections in June. Is there anything in that, and what could be the impact in a political sense?
Oh, there's no doubt that the far right has been milking this sense of revolt for a few years, and is going to benefit from this unrest, especially because they position themselves as those who defend, quote unquote, the people against, quote unquote, the system. So their discourse has been in line with this feeling that there's a divide between the working people and the governing, entities. And so they have already the discourse that matches the sentiment of the population. And so they're winning elections in different countries. You've mentioned France, where the National Front, the National Rally, is said to be the first party to win the European elections. In Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland has been really successful in recent elections as well.
Professor Cecile Alduit, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Venezuela's Supreme Court has upheld an election ban against opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, taking her out of the presidential race this year. Machado accuses Nicolas Maduro's government of starting a, quote, repressive escalation. Both the opposition and the US say this is a repudiation of the Barbados Agreement signed in October. Maduro pledged to hold free and fair elections in exchange for sanctions relief. The US says it is now re-evaluating the deal. Without offering evidence, Venezuela's government spokesman accused the opposition of masterminding a, quote, coup d'etat that included killing the president. CNN cannot independently verify that claim. Iran is strongly condemning a shooting attack in its southeast border region that killed 9 Pakistani workers. In a telegram message, Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs expressed sympathy with the victims and the families and the Pakistani government. It also said investigations into the attack are underway. Unidentified gunmen killed 9 people on Saturday in the border city of Saravan. According to Iranian state media, no group or individual has claimed responsibility for the attack so far. Some of the victims' families are urging the Pakistani government to bring back the bodies of their loved ones.
We ask that the Pakistani government repatriate the bodies and hand them over to relatives. Those injured should also be brought to their relatives so that their wounds can heal.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is repeating his claims about Nazism in Ukraine as he marked a major Soviet victory in World War II. On Saturday, he was joined by his ally, the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, to mark 80 years since the siege of Leningrad was broken. Mr. Putin compared Ukraine's government with Nazi Germany, which is a line he's been using to rally support for the war and used as an excuse for the war. Historians and political commentators dismiss that comparison, and so has the Ukrainian government. Now, one of the world's most famous museums is taking down some displays. As we'll tell you just ahead, it's all part of a new culture of respect for Indigenous peoples. We'll be right back. Aryna Sabalenka is now a two-time Grand Slam winner after successfully defending her Women's Australian Open title against China's Zhang Xinwen in 2 straight sets. Sabalenka is the first woman since Serena Williams in 2007 to win the Open final without dropping a single service game. Here she is reflecting on the momentous victory.
I'm speechless right now. I don't know how to describe my emotions, but definitely I'm super happy and proud of everything I was able to achieve so far. Now having 2 Grand Slam titles, it's definitely given me more confidence and believe in myself. And I just had this knowing that all my life it wasn't like wasting of time, and I was doing the right thing, and I'm where I'm meant to be. So that's really important.
Another high-profile resignation in European football. FC Barcelona manager Xavi Hernandez has announced he's going to be leaving the club at the end of the season, despite recently signing a 2-year contract extension. Xavi broke the news following the team's 5-3 loss against Villarreal and assured fans it's in the best interests of the club.
I think
the club needs a change of dynamic. This is the best thinking, especially for the good of the players as well. I think they will feel free and they will feel calm. I think that there's a lot of tension right now. I think it'll be good for the board of directors. As a fan, I think it's the best decision to have me leaving on June 30th.
A cultural shift and legal requirement are prompting a major American museum in New York to close certain exhibits for ethical reasons. It involves artifacts by Indigenous peoples. CNN's Gloria Pazmino reports.
So this is an iconic location, not just here in New York City, but really in much of the world. The American Museum of Natural History is one of the most visited museums in the entire world. It draws about 4.5 million people every year. So the fact that they're making this change really sends a major signal to the rest of the field. And here's what's happening. The museum is closing 2 major galleries this weekend, including the Eastern Woodlands and the Great Plains Gallery. And what they contain is several Native American cultural items, some pretty sizable big objects as well, many of them recognizable to anyone who's visited this museum. And they are going to be covering up those display cases. Now, we actually asked to go inside the museum today to try and get some video of these displays that will no longer be viewed by the public, but we were not allowed because part of the whole point here is to no longer show off or display any of these pieces in any way. Now, why is this happening? Well, they're trying to be in compliance with these new federal guidelines, which are now going to require museums and federal agencies to consult and obtain informed consent from descendants, tribes, or Native Hawaiian organizations before displaying or researching human remains or cultural items. Now, this is actually an update to the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And this law has been on the books for a while now, but there has been criticism from indigenous people that the experience of the nations and indigenous voices was not centered enough in the process. So this is an attempt to rectify that. Take a listen to the museum president, who we spoke with early this morning, describing what is actually behind this effort.
The intent of the regulations, and I think the intent of this process, is to make sure that the voices of Indigenous peoples have a say both in how their stories are told in museums and participate actively in the presentation of their narratives in museums.
And it's not just this museum here in New York City, but also other major organizations around the country, including the Field Museum in Chicago, the museum in Denver, and the Cleveland Museum as well. They have all taken measures to either remove or cover up their exhibits as they begin this process. Now, the question is whether or not some of these exhibits will ever return, and the museum president issued a letter to his staff here yesterday saying that while some items might return, others might not return after they are returned to their rightful owners. Gloria Pasmino in New York, CNN.
In Italy, the Venice Carnival is paying tribute to one of the city's greatest travellers, Marco Polo, to mark the 700th anniversary of his death. Today is Carnival Day in Venice. Hundreds of boats set to take part in a parade along the Grand Canal to officially open this year's festivities. Events will run through February 13. Thanks for spending part of your day with me. I'm Michael Holmes. Inside Africa is next, and Linda Kincaid will pick up with more news in about 30 minutes from now. I'll see you tomorrow.
Trains have played a major role in shaping the development of the African continent. Today, across southern Africa, they do more than simply transport goods and commuters. From a unique hotel in the heart of an iconic game park, the so-called train on the bridge.
We do have guests that are coming from different countries. So when they visit the train for the first time, it's breathtaking.
To one of the world's most luxurious passenger trains.
In the beginning, I really thought we were going to get a lot more train enthusiasts. 95% of our passengers were just travelers looking for an experience.
And across South Africa, committed enthusiasts are working to keep classic trains on the tracks.
We're enthusiasts, but we're professional enthusiasts. We have to maintain the equipment. A lot of work, a lot of money goes into it. We want everything we've got to work.
And they all attract visitors from around the world.
We've had people from the USA, Canada, Germany, UK, Australia.
Well, it's part of our heritage. I mean, railways built the world. As the industrial age, railways built it.
These are the trains of Southern Africa. This is Inside Africa. For more than 150 years, the history of South Africa's railways has been filled with classic trains and some colourful characters. One was the pet and later assistant of double-leg amputee signalman James Jumper Wide. Jack the Baboon was taught how to pull levers as needed and did so until his death in 1890, after almost 10 years of faultless service. Today, more than 130 years later, one South African company is taking passengers back to the golden age of rail travel. The Rovos rail story dates back to the mid-1980s, when founder Rohan Vos was approached by a colleague with an unusual request to help create a steam train preservation group.
So I got involved financially, helped them a little bit with this, that and the other. And then I thought it might be fun to have my own locomotive and have my own coaches.
He purchased a locomotive and 4 coaches and decided to apply for permission to use track belonging to the South African Railways.
I applied. They came back and said, yes, you can, but the tariff was very high. And I complained, and they said, why don't you sell tickets? And that was the end of the hobby. I then purchased another 3 carriages, and we launched in 1989, 34 and a half years ago.
Operations manager Joe Matala has been a part of the team since the beginning.
I joined Rovos Rail at inception back in 1989. I was here when we did a first trip, so I grew up in a company, and there's no job in this business that I haven't done.
For more than 30 years, the acquisition of locomotives and carriages has never stopped.
The first purchase, in fact, was for 38 from the railways back in 1994. And of course, we've been building ever since. We've got the 140 coaches running now. We are still finding coaches on sidings all over the country that are rusted to hell and gone. And we buy them scrap there, and then we've got to make them roadworthy or railworthy.
Here, we take old, rotten things that people have thrown away, we bring them back to life. It's the biggest working junkyard in the world.
Today, Rovos Rail boasts meticulously restored vintage carriages and offers luxury suites and surprisingly spacious cabins, all with ensuite bathrooms. As its fleet grew, so too did the number of Rovos Rail routes. In 1993, they travelled to Dar es Salaam for the first time.
Financially, it was a huge disaster for me, but because we lost everything that we had, sending the train there. But today, it's the best decision I ever made, because we're running 5 trips a year to Dar es Salaam now, and we've also done from Dar es Salaam across the continent to Angola, and that's the first train in history to have done that.
During the 2000s, they continued to offer new journeys across the subcontinent.
We do Namibia, we have Vic Falls on a regular basis, and we do the golf tour. We have Durban, and we came up with a a trilogy now, which is a 15-day journey. And so there we are. We have about 10 different products now. We are doing every route that there is to do in Southern Africa now.
Today, passengers are departing from Victoria Falls and heading south through Zimbabwe to the Rovos Rail headquarters in Pretoria, South Africa. En route, the train travels on one of the longest sections of straight railway in the world and passes scattered ancient baobab trees before crossing into South Africa. On the last leg of its journey, it travels through the Waterpoort Valley, winding its way alongside the Sand River. Wherever you are, however, the train offers a level of service one would expect in a 5-star hotel.
I really need a very strong team, and I believe it's something that we have here at Rovos Rail. And we all have one common goal, which is to make each and every passengers on board the train to get the service that they paid for.
After sundowner drinks in one of the lounges, passengers return to their cabins to prepare for a formal dinner. They are called to the silver service 4-course meal as they would have been 100 years ago. The onboard dining experience is exceptional, and along with an extensive and varied selection of the finest South African wines, passengers can enjoy gourmet meals prepared under somewhat challenging conditions.
Without any communication, you cannot succeed in the kitchen. So you have to be a team player, then you have to be a skillful. So we are 3 chefs, then we have 3 assistant chefs. And that time is very busy, very busy. It's like that in the kitchen when you play chess. So this one must come there, this one must come because it must go through. It can be about 70 people, breakfast, lunch, dinner. It's not the same as other kitchens.
When not enjoying the old world elegance of the dining cars, passengers can appreciate panoramic views from the observation car at the rear of the train. Rovos Rail does offer unique off-train excursions, allowing passengers to explore destinations and attractions along the route. For those on the Victoria Falls journey, this includes a game drive at Hwangwe, Zimbabwe's largest national park. As journeys cross international borders and change national rail networks, it falls to operations manager Joe Matala and train manager Lawrence Zulu to keep the trains on time and the guests happy.
The terrain we are operating in is very, very, very challenging. We're operating in South Africa, we're operating in Zimbabwe, we're operating in Zambia, Tanzania, and in Congo. And technology is one of the best. 80% of the time you have to speak either on a satellite phone or on a WhatsApp call. So it is very challenging that way.
Of course, when we do leave, embarking on our journey with our passengers on board, going to different destinations, different countries, it's very important that all our staff members are very well trained. I wouldn't call us colleagues, we are more like a family. If one team member struggle, we jump in and help.
From its roots in the preservation of steam locomotives, Rovos Rail has evolved, and today a fleet of Australian-made diesel locomotives form the core of their fleet.
Steam engines was the reason that we got into this business in the first place, but they do break down, they're old. You need a lot of water, you need a lot of coal. They use 500 litres of water per kilometre. They use 75 kilograms of coal per kilometre. Then we realised it was better to go electric anyway. We realised that from South Africa northwards, there is no electricity, no overhead cable, so we needed diesel locos.
And as the business has grown, it's continued to evolve and to innovate, something it's done since its humble beginnings.
We mustn't forget that at the time we started, 1989, there were no trains in the world with double beds and bathroom en suite. That didn't exist.
I've seen the company grow from running 1 train a month in 1989, 1990, to today running 6, 7 trains at the same time.
And for Rohan Vos, for once, he's not currently eyeing out any more old locomotives.
But we've got to 6 trains now, 6 trains of 21 coaches each, and for the moment that's enough.
The story of trains in South Africa has a new chapter, and it's about a train that's ironically going nowhere. Kruger Shalati, the train on the bridge, is a luxurious, artfully refurbished train with a breathtaking view, situated in South Africa's largest national park. It's the brainchild of businessman Jerry Mabena, and it's an idea that had its roots 100 years ago when the park was proclaimed.
Around that time, I think people used to go into the park using steam trains. So the idea for us was to reenact that experience in some form or other. When we had the opportunity to buy mothballed old carriages from Transnet, which is our rail logistics operator in South Africa, we couldn't say no to the idea.
The train carriages have been skillfully converted into suites with comfortable beds, ensuite bathrooms, and private decks that overlook the river and the wildlife below.
We were trying to find a look that is non-colonial, because we actually had an opportunity to look at buying old established rail carriages and just refurbishing them a little bit and putting them on there. So when we bought the carriages, we just thought, let's just redo them from scratch.
Being inside the national park, Kruger Shalati provides guests with a unique opportunity to experience the park's incredible wildlife, viewed from the comfort of their suite.
The way Kruger Shalati is positioned on a bridge that faces north to south, all of our windows actually face towards the east, which is ideal for the sun coming up. Our guests start their day with this amazing open air choir that is a quintessential part of being in the bush.
The hotel also offers a gourmet dining experience, allowing guests to savor delicious meals while taking in the breathtaking scenery. The focus is on South African cuisine and makes use of some unusual ingredients.
Some people, they expect it, they don't need convincing because they're in the bush, so they would like to try your venisons, they would like to try your crocodile, they would like to try the smoked springbok carpaccio that we've got on the menus. Two of the most popular dishes here at Kruger Shalati would be the Lesotho salmon trout, which we've paired with garden peas, pumpkin puree, fondant potatoes, and finish it off with a very nice, light and sharp lime beurre blanc. And then we've got the venison shank, slowly cooked for about 6 hours, and then it falls off the bone. And that goes with baby beets, roasted parsnip puree, and then with lightly toshed figs. Finish it off with a very nice red wine jus. Mother Nature is the true artist. Take simple ingredients and just transform them into something amazing.
Philemon is one of the longest standing employees at Kruger Shalati.
The management here hired me to plant indigenous trees and all types of bushes. Everything I planted grew 100%. Here we are planting spinach, and it grows so well. We make juice from the spinach and the guests love it. The lettuce, we don't want to run short because we need it and it's important. If we have beetroot, that's also needed.
The team at Kruger Shalati is made up primarily of people drawn from nearby communities.
For me, more than that, I just love the people there. I think there is a warmth that comes from the people that come from the area.
So Shalati came to their village and they were looking like people that they can employ inside. So I was lucky to be like one of them. When I see the advertisement, I said, no, one day I want to work on that train on the bridge because it's very unique.
Hello everyone. Hi. Ready for your game ride? Yes. Okay, let's rock and roll.
Thank you. Today, Tuli is one of a dozen guides who take guests on game drives to explore the Kruger National Park.
Big crocodile there.
Some, however, choose to view wildlife from a unique vantage point.
What we have that's very different is really to do that in a train. Having hippos grunting underneath the carriage attracts people who just want to be in the wild but don't want to be immersed in the wild. You kind of want to be able to look at the animals but from a position of safety.
The glass-walled train rooms allow for views along the length of the river, and a deck and pool offer a swimming experience unlike any other. It's in the lounge alongside the deck that afternoon tea is served.
I've done that walk, I don't know how many times. But every time I go over that, I still want to see what's in the riverbed, what's on the trees in terms of the beds.
And for visitors to the national park who aren't guests at Kruger Shalati, there's also Kruger Station.
The last train that actually used to go into the park still sits at what we call Kruger Station today, and people can still go there, take pictures on it. It just brings that old romance back into the space.
What sets Kruger Shalati apart is its remarkable location and the concept behind the train on the bridge. Getting it built was a monumental task.
We went out around the country to look for a particular style of carriage, and we had to find a specially designed flatbed truck to actually load them and move them up and down.
But for Jerry Mabena, it's all been worth it.
The culture of steam trains and the culture of historical trains, I think, is beginning to re-emerge. We don't have a moving steam train, but one day I think we will.
The KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa is where the country's first passenger train was unveiled in 1860. And today it's home to the Umgeni Steam Railway. It's a railway dedicated to preserving and operating vintage steam locomotives, and it offers passengers a chance to experience the nostalgia of steam-era train travel.
When we started this back in 1982, the railway history in this province was literally disappearing as we watched, and nobody was doing anything about it. Nothing was really being done to preserve that history, and we decided we had to take it upon ourselves. So we privately began to secure locomotives, coaches, and a depot, and eventually a line to operate on. And now we have a collection of 10 locomotives, more than 50 coaches, and a number of historic wagons.
Today, the Umgeni Steam Railway offers regular, family-friendly passenger services, allowing visitors to take scenic trips on their historic steam trains.
Our operation is very much like the railways were in the old days. We run with a 1938 steam locomotive and 4 coaches, also from the 1930s. It's a time-consuming operation. The loco comes around, has to shunt the whole yard around because we've got so much stock in the yard now. Eventually we get the loco onto the train, the public on board, and we're off to Botha's Hill. That has some of the steepest gradients and sharpest curves of any railway in the world. At Botha's Hill, we have a 15-minute turnaround. The passengers can hop out, stretch their legs if they want to. The loco couples are on the other end of the train, and we're off back down to Inchanga again. And on the way we go through what is probably the oldest operating tunnel still in the country, built in 1879.
The railway boasts a collection of well-maintained vintage steam locomotives, restored to their former glory, and are an attraction for steam train enthusiasts and history buffs alike.
We're almost entirely reliant on the public participation in our operations to fund us. We can't rely on railway enthusiasts to keep us going because that's such a small niche of the market. So we've tried to make the thing as family friendly as possible. Everybody loves the train ride.
The Umgeni Steam Railway plays a vital role in preserving South Africa's railway heritage and provides a unique and nostalgic experience for both locals and tourists.
The line we operate on, even though it doesn't belong to us, we're entirely responsible for its maintenance and upkeep, and we are trying to keep this preservation of railways alive in this province.
In the neighbouring Free State province of South Africa, Sandstone Estates is a vast agricultural and heritage preservation property located in the shadow of the Maluti Mountains, near the town of Vicksburg.
Of course, the draw card really is for people to come here and to be able to see things we preserve. So our byline is preserving the past for the future. That's what we basically do. And when the farm was purchased, there was a small collection of antique tractors. And that was really the start of the kind of bug that started to bite. And somebody who worked for us made a suggestion that what we should do is put the little bit of railway line we had, put the locomotive on it and just run up and down on a very, very short distance. And it started to snowball, and the railway line was built today, which is 26 kilometers long.
Created by entrepreneur Wolf Mole, Sandstone Estates has the largest private collection of narrow-gauge steam locomotives and rolling stock in the world.
We get visitors from the United States, all over Europe, Japan, Australia, that come out and spend their time here. So without being egotistical, the Sandstone Steam Railway is regarded as probably the best in the world.
The collection includes a diverse and extensive assortment of locomotives, painstakingly restored and maintained. Many were sourced from the South African National Rail Company.
We did not want a static display museum. We wanted a museum that worked. As far as the coaches and wagons are concerned, we wanted to give international visitors a chance to basically really immerse themselves in the experience. So some would be passengers, some would be freight, some would be petrol tankers, and you would see how these locomotives worked in the past.
Sandstone Estates hosts various heritage railway events and steam festivals throughout the year, attracting enthusiasts and visitors from around the world. These allow visitors to experience the charm of steam train travel, and their fleet is kept ready to roll.
It's an ongoing job. You can't leave a piece of machinery like this standing around. It's easier for us to continue to maintain them because we're holding events on an ongoing basis. We have tour groups coming in, so we have to keep the locomotives running in order to be able to present the product to them because they're very specific. They know what they're talking about.
And for the train drivers, these aren't mere machines.
A driver will fall in love with his locomotive. You have to have a feeling for it. You've got to have a feeling for the engine. There's the steam, there's the pressure, there's the coal, there's the fire. It's a whole working relationship where the driver becomes one with the locomotive. It actually runs in their blood, and it's very interesting to see how they interact with the machines.
Perhaps not surprisingly, it also attracts photographers and filmmakers.
The Free State light is some of the best light in South Africa for photography. And of course you've got the Sandstone Mountains, and we've got the scenery, and when you see a steam train rolling along with mountains in the background, the sunsets and the sunrises in this part of the world, especially in the winter, are just unbelievable. You know what's interesting about steam is that it's somehow not just nostalgic, it's actually quite a beautiful thing.
Hello and welcome to all our viewers here in the United States and around the world. I'm Linda Kincaid. Just ahead on CNN Newsroom, the UN chief calls on nations to rethink their decision to cut funding after disturbing allegations against some staff members in Gaza. Plus, museums across the U.S. are set to look a lot different. Details on the new regulations that could soon finally set things right for native cultures. But will this change? And the former president takes jabs on two fronts, says Trump, Biden and Haley hit the campaign trail.
Live from Atlanta, this is CNN Newsroom with Linda Kincaid.
The head of the UN agency helping Palestinian civilians in Gaza says the group might have to end operations there. These 9 countries stopped funding for UN Relief and Works Agency after accusations by Israel that a handful of their workers were involved in the October 7th Hamas terror attack. Israel has not publicly released its evidence, but it says it shared that evidence with UNRWA and the United States. The UN group fired 9 accused staffers and launched an investigation into the allegations. It said that one other staffer accused had died and that the identities of 2 others are being verified. Well, now the UN Secretary General is weighing in, saying the abhorrent alleged acts of these staff members must have consequences. But the tens of thousands of men and women who work for UNRWA, many in some of the most dangerous situations for humanitarian workers, should not be penalized. The dire needs of the desperate populations they serve must be met. Well, 2 million civilians in Gaza rely on that aid from UNRWA. These needs are, of course, growing as Israel continues its military operation in Khan Yunis. Families are evacuating but struggling to find shelter. Besides hunger, fierce rain and cold weather are making their escape even more miserable. Well, further north in Gaza City, Palestinians are rushing to grab sacks of flour that were delivered Saturday. The UN warned this week that parts of the territory are facing famine, and residents say the aid isn't reaching everyone.
Today, I came to get flour, and I couldn't get any. Some people got 3 bags of flour, and some got 4, and I didn't get any. I have 3 children, and I don't know how to feed them. God help us.
Only the young men can take sacks of flour, but the elderly can't. The children, the orphans, and the mothers of orphans, only the strong young men can take a share, but the orphans don't have shares at all.
And Palestinian officials say hospitals in Khan Yunis are under siege by Israeli troops. According to the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health, the Nasser medical complex is running out of anesthesia, drugs and other medication and blood for transfusions, a shortage that the ministry spokesperson calls severe and dangerous. Doctors Without Borders say the hospital's vital medical services have collapsed. CNN's Paula Hancock joins us now live from Abu Dhabi with more on the UNRWA controversy and the need for aid in Gaza. Good to have you with us, Paula. So 8 countries have stopped funding UNRWA because of the accusations against the 12 workers. Israel, of course, has long accused that agency of colluding with Hamas. What does this mean, really, for the people in Gaza who rely on this agency, which employs about 13,000 people in Gaza?
Well, Linda, this is the biggest source of humanitarian aid for those in Gaza who desperately need it at this point. We heard from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying that there are some 2 million people who are currently relying on what UNRWA provides. It is the biggest group, and it is the main way that some aid is getting into Gaza. We've heard UN officials warning that there could be a looming famine and warning of catastrophic consequences if this aid does not get in. There is a widespread understanding that not enough is getting in as it is. Now, we heard from the Secretary General saying that at this point UNRWA has funding, but it won't last until the end of February. So given the extreme need that residents in Gaza have, there is a serious concern among UNRWA as to how they are going to continue to give this aid. Now, they have been calling on these countries who have temporarily halted funding to reconsider their decision. The head of UNRWA itself, Philippe Lazzarini, issued a statement saying that these decisions were shocking, saying, quote, "It would be immensely irresponsible to sanction an agency and an entire community it serves because of allegations of criminal acts against some individuals, especially at a time of war, displacement and political crises in the region." Now, these same heads of UNRWA have pointed out that they have made immediate decisions into these serious allegations. As you say, 9 staffers have been fired instantly, and there is an investigation that will be ongoing as well. Now, there are some countries, for example, Norway and Ireland, who say they will continue funding, knowing that it is needed and trusting in the UN to be able to investigate. Linda?
And of course, Paula, the Israeli Prime Minister has criticised a protest by families of hostages held in Gaza, saying they're useless. He's clearly feeling the pressure. He's also calling on Qatar to use its leverage with Hamas. Just to explain what he said.
Well, back last Tuesday on Israeli television, there was an alleged leaked audio of Benjamin Netanyahu that was aired on Israeli television. And at the time, he had been criticising Qatar for its links with Hamas and for not doing enough to try and free the hostages. This weekend, he doubled down on that message on Saturday, saying that he's not taking back one word that he said. Let's listen to what exactly he said.
Qatar hosts the leaders of Hamas. It also funds Hamas. It has leverage over Hamas. Qatar committed to make sure that the medication will reach the districts of Hamas to our hostages, and Qatar said that it can help bring them back. So, therefore, to put pressure on them, they position themselves as mediators. So please, go right ahead and prove it. Let them be so good as to bring back our hostages.
Now, the CIA Director, Bill Burns, is going to be meeting with the intelligence chiefs of Israel and Egypt in the coming days, trying to hammer out a new deal to try and release some of these hostages. There's reports of a cessation in hostilities in Gaza in order to allow this to happen. Nothing publicly being announced at this point. Linda?
Okay. Paula Hancock's for us in Abu Dhabi. Good to have you with us. Thank you. Well, CNN has some new video out of southern Israel near the Gaza border showing armed Israeli soldiers guarding more than 24 Palestinian detainees wearing only lightweight disposable white coveralls despite the freezing temperatures. Sitting and kneeling on the ground, the men are blindfolded and barefoot. Their hands are tied behind their backs. Israeli authorities say the men are being held for what they called suspected terrorist activities after being detained inside Gaza. The IDF says in a statement, quote, relevant suspects are taken for further questioning within Israel. Individuals who are not found to be taking part in terrorist activities are released back into Gaza as soon as possible. The IDF claims the men are being treated in accordance with international law and that they were stripped to ensure they weren't carrying any concealed weapons. The UN and rights groups have previously condemned Israel for alleged mistreatment of detainees. Many detainees have alleged abuse at the hands of Israeli forces, and that includes several Palestinian boys and men who told CNN in December they were detained for 5 days before being released, emerging with bruised and swollen wrists. Well, an IDF official estimates that only 60% of the tunnels built by Hamas under Gaza have been found so far, as the war with Hamas nears its 4th month. But as CNN's Jeremy Diamond reports, that's just one of the challenges facing Israel as they work to drive out militants and find the remaining hostages.
The bullet went in the cheek, got inside my jaw and took a piece of my jaw and on the corner, and then went down over here to my neck and stayed there.
Master Sergeant Omri Arental is lucky to be alive.
That's the bullet here. Wow.
Kneeling on the edge of this tunnel shaft, he says he was shot by a Hamas militant hidden inside. A ricochet off the tunnel wall likely saving his life.
When I turned my flashlight on, I saw a gun light, like flash. Yeah, gun flash. And then I felt like 5 kilos hammer that was inside the hot lava, just like punched into my face.
As he crawled away from the tunnel shaft, the soldiers in his combat engineering unit killed the gunman. But his brush with death speaks to the enormous challenge Hamas tunnels still present to the Israeli military after 3 months of war.
There is upper Gaza and lower Gaza. There is upper Khan Yunis and lower Khan Yunis. It is a very tough mission.
General Nitzan Nuriel, a former member of Israel's National Security Council, estimates that Israel has only discovered about 60% of the hundreds of miles of tunnels below Gaza.
We blew up something like 20%. So a lot of work ahead of us. It's not something that can be finished within a few weeks. It's a question of months.
Exposing and destroying these tunnels has been central to Israel's mission in Gaza, where it has dropped enormous bunker-busting bombs that penetrate deep underground, leaving enormous craters and often causing heavy civilian casualties. But there is also concern for Israeli hostages held underground.
We cannot just blow up all those tunnels, assuming that the hostages are there. At least 50% of them. So we have to do it slowly.
That means sending troops deep into booby-trapped tunnels where Hamas fighters could be laying in wait before rigging and detonating them. In the meantime, many Hamas fighters are surviving in sophisticated tunnels, equipped with electricity, bathrooms, and stocks of food and water. But for how much longer?
How long they can stay there? It's a good question. Not for good. They will not be able to survive there because of all those conditions for, let's say, more than 2 more months.
For now, at least, that means the battle rages on, both above and below the surface.
Well, the U.S. says an oil tanker hit by a Houthi missile in the Gulf of Aden on Friday was carrying a highly flammable cargo. Indian, French and American ships responded to the distress call and helped put the fire out. Boat crew members are reportedly okay, and the ship's operator says it is sailing towards a safe harbor. Despite continued warnings and strikes from the U.S., Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen continue to attack ships in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, saying it's in support of the Palestinian people. French farmers are taking to the streets, literally lining tractors blocking a major highway out of Paris. The farmers' grievances include the cost of fuel and competition from Ukrainian farmers. France is Europe's largest food producer, but other EU nations have seen similar protests. And now French farmers are threatening to use their tractors to barricade Paris on Monday. Still to come.
What Joe Biden is doing is a crime against our nation. It's an absolute betrayal of our country.
You're the reason Donald Trump is a defeated former president.
The latest from the U.S. presidential race is former President Donald Trump faces a two-front fight against Republican contender Nikki Haley and President Joe Biden. And one of the most famous museums in the United States is taking down some of its displays this weekend. It's part of a nationwide change in the way museums treat Indigenous culture. We'll have the story coming up. Welcome back. Museums across the U.S. are closing or changing their exhibits featuring cultural artifacts from Native American tribes. The move is in a response to new federal regulations aimed at obtaining consent from or returning the items to the tribes that consider them sacred. CNN's Gloria Pazmino reports from the world's largest natural history museum about how they're adapting to the changes.
So this is an iconic location, not just here in New York City, but really in much of the world. The American Museum of Natural History is one of the most visited museums in the entire world. It draws about 4.5 million people every year. So the fact that they're making this change really sends a major signal to the rest of the field. And here's what's happening. The museum is closing 2 major galleries this weekend, including the Eastern Woodlands and the Great Plains Gallery. And what they contain is several Native American cultural items, some pretty sizable big objects as well, many of them recognizable to anyone who's visited this museum. And they are going to be covering up those display cases. Now, we actually asked to go inside the museum today to try and get some video of these displays that will no longer be viewed by the public, but we were not allowed because part of the whole point here is to no longer show off or display any of these pieces in any way. Now, why is this happening? Well, they're trying to be in compliance with these new federal guidelines, which are now going to require museums and federal agencies to consult and obtain informed consent from descendants, tribes, or Native Hawaiian organizations before displaying or researching human remains or cultural items. Now, this is actually an update to the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And this law has been on the books for a while now, but there has been criticism from indigenous people that the experience of the nations and indigenous voices was not centered enough in the process. So this is an attempt to rectify that. Take a listen to the museum president who we spoke with early this morning, describing what is actually behind this effort.
The intent of the regulations, and I think the intent of this process, is to make sure that the voices of Indigenous peoples have a say both in how their stories are told in museums and participate actively in the presentation of their narratives in museums.
It's not just this museum here in New York City, but also other major organizations around the country, including the Field Museum in Chicago, the museum in Denver, and the Cleveland Museum as well. They have all taken measures to either remove or cover up their exhibits as they begin this process. Now, the question is whether or not some of these exhibits will ever return, and the museum president issued a letter to his staff here yesterday saying that while some items might return, others might not return after they are returned to their rightful owners. Gloria Pazmino in New York, CNN.
Well, it's not just U.S. institutions that are reassessing how they display Indigenous art and cultural artefacts. Other museums are unveiling similar efforts. The UK says it will send back gold and silver artefacts that were looted from Ghana nearly 150 years ago by British troops. 2 British museums announced the move as part of a long-term loan agreement with the West African nation. Museum officials say the artefacts were taken from Ghana during the 19th century. They add that many of the objects, including more than a dozen pieces from the Asante Royal Court, were looted during war. Some of the relics were believed to hold the spirit of past royal figures. Jeffrey Robertson is a prominent human rights attorney and the author of Who Owns History. He joins us now live from Melbourne, Australia. Great to have you with us.
Yes, it's an important development because Britain, of course, is behind America, a long way behind America, because its museums are full of the loot of the colonial era. Much of the gold, for example, from the Asante tribes was seized by what would now be called war crimes. The local population, sneeringly regarded as natives and as inferior, were killed by modern Mauser rifles and so on. and that their temples and their homes were stripped of anything with gold or silver, and it was auctioned off. It frequently went to the British Museum or to one or other national museums. And then, as if to put in law the colonial mentality, which still exists in the British Parliament, they had a law which prevented any of this stolen property or seized property from being returned.
Yeah, so
this is still the law. And so the only way they can get them back is by giving them as a loan, a 3-year loan. Will go, this valuable cultural heritage property will be returned to Ghana. But of course, it's pretty rich to have your cultural property returned to you as a loan. And I think that the courts in Ghana will eventually strike this down because it was property obtained during a war crime.
And it includes 32 pieces, right, of gold and silver artifacts that have been described as crown jewels. And as you point out, they're not going to be returned permanently, just a 3-year loan that can be extended. Is it time to give them back permanently, or do you see this as at least some sort of step in the right direction?
It would be more honest to give them back permanently, but the British Parliament and government is infected by this post-colonial. I mean, once Britain had an empire, and this is the last vestige of it that they can cling to. So they have this absurd law that museums cannot de-access or give back any property that they've received, however much it was stolen or obtained by criminal activity. So that's the problem. To get round it, the museums who want to do the right thing, do not include the British Museum, but other museums, will in fact loan it back. And perhaps they won't seek in 3 years' time to collect on the loan. But that's a
or Ghana
device.
could potentially extend
device.
it.
And I think the Ghanaians will be perfectly entitled to get a declaration from a court saying that it shouldn't go back because it was property that was stolen or obtained under pressure of war crimes.
But of course, this is just a very small number of artifacts, given that about 90% of African cultural property resides in European musicians. That's, of course, according to a report commissioned by the French President Emmanuel Macron, who, of course, believes they should be returned. But I do have to ask you just quickly that British institutions like the British Museum have long argued that they've preserved these items, they've taken great care of them, and that they can be widely studied in their museums. What do you make of those arguments?
Well, they're correct in some cases, but totally false in others. Certainly, the British Museum has taken care of the Rosetta Stone, and that's important because it's in the British Museum that the stone began to speak, that we actually discovered what it said. But in other cases, like the famous Parthenon marbles that were looted by Lord Elgin, that's been a different matter.
And we
badly handled, and they really should go back to Greece because they're the greatest still extant
we have been covering
of
that.
the ancient world.
We have to leave it there. Jeffrey Robertson, good to have you on the program. Sorry to cut you off there. We've got to wrap it up, but appreciate your perspective. Thanks so much. And we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Hello and welcome to Marketplace Africa. We cover the biggest economic trends impacting the continent. I'm Zain Asher. While Uganda has long relied on specific exports like coffee to drive economic growth, the increased viability of a budding sector is driving new investment across the country. Take a look.
It is low-hanging fruit in exports because you can quickly boost, increase, expand the volumes of production.
In 2021, the global silk market was valued at just over $15.5 billion. But according to the United Nations Comtrade database, Uganda only exported nearly $44,500 worth of silk in 2020. The executive director of Uganda's Export Promotion Board, the national agency tasked with developing trade within the country, says with silk exports from China in decline, Uganda has a chance to fill that gap in the market.
Globally, we have 40 countries involved in sericulture. Majority of them, they are not in Africa. You are looking at Italy, you are looking at China, you are looking at India, you are looking at Vietnam. Uganda is in Africa, I think I can't say that is on top. These efforts I'm seeing, if we push them for the next 5 years, I assure you, if we are on the mark, we will be among the top 8.
The head of the Tropical Institute of Development Innovations believes Uganda's landscape is optimal for production.
In Uganda, unlike elsewhere in the world, to get the best quality silk yarn, the process starts from the garden. All those factors of the good soils, the good weather, are contributing towards having the best leaf, and this best leaf is fed on the mulberry.
The company launched a brand called U-Silk and recently invested in ways to ramp up commercialization.
So here we are sitting on a total of more than 1,000 acres. We have started by planting 300 acres here, and we continue to plant. So next rain season, we harvest around 20,000 kilograms of leaf after 1.5 months. Now that should be able to feed at least 4 boxes of silkworm eggs. Those 4 boxes, you'll be producing at least 1,000 kilograms of silk cocoons.
As the bottom line grows for local producers, their efforts are also helping individual farmers reap the benefits.
Almost 100,000 new jobs going to produce from this business. In our farm, we have the over 10 million mulberry plant. We have the facility for rearing 500 boxes of the silkworm eggs per 1 month's rearing cycle. Out of the 1 box, if you get 20 to 25 kilogram of the cocoon, you multiply 20 kilogram times $14. That is a $280 for 1 box. Means if any farmer in the house can keep 1 acre of the mulberry or half acre of the mulberry, every month they can rear something between 2 to 3 boxes every month.
To become a leading supplier of silk, the private sector is seeking government support.
In 2019, under Ministry of Science and Technology, the agriculture policy has been formulated and an implementation strategy has also been implemented.
Despite the government suspending funds for the Tropical Institute of Development Innovations because of claims the organization misused its funding, a claim the company denies, major players are confident in their ability to position Uganda well within the growing market.
Our target is at least 1,000 tons in the period that we are looking at for 5 years. If we can establish 50,000 acres of land, our minimum will be 2,000 metric tons per year, and the 2,000 metric tons will be bringing us at least $100 million of income every year.
We invest on that project to be pilot, to be example, to train the others.
And with the global silk market projected to reach $34 billion by 2031, industry leaders believe silk will soon become a central thread to Uganda's economic success.
Uganda is open for business. to tell the world that Uganda has created an enabling environment for investing in Uganda and for trading in and from Uganda.
We want to compete globally. We are going for the high end, especially for post-cocoon process, because we want to be exactly at the same level with China, with India, with Japan, and those top players.
Coming up next, how a South African company is giving the gift of healthy hearing. Welcome back. The World Health Organization estimates that by the year 2050, around 2.5 billion people worldwide will have some degree of hearing loss. It's that population the South African company Hearex Group is hoping to help in the coming years. CNN's Linda Kincaid sat down with the company's CEO, Nick Klopper, to talk about the products they're developing and what needs to be done to deploy their innovations across the world.
Currently, hearing loss is called the silent epidemic. And it's silent because we can't see it. It's around us, people are living with it. So it's a very big problem that we are addressing. My name is Nick Klopper, and I'm the CEO of the Hearex Group and Lexi Hearing.
Nick, take us back to how Hearex came about.
Hearex started back in 2015 when we wanted to democratize access during healthcare services. We're a spin-out from the University of Pretoria here in South Africa, and where we took a very novel idea of seeing if we can put a hearing test on a smartphone. Typically, hearing tests are done on these big audiometric equipment, which cost thousands of dollars, and can only be done by specialized people like audiologists. And we wanted to bring access to people.
Who is your target customer, and where are they generally located?
If you look at the prevalence rates, 1 in 3 people at the age of 65 need a hearing aid. Traditionally, it's people that are of age or older, and specifically countries which has an aging world population are also countries which could benefit the most from our technologies. For Lexi Hearing, which is our hearing aid brand, 100% of those customers are based currently in the US.
Nick, can you explain the development of Lexi Hearing and how you were able to develop these over-the-counter hearing aids in the US?
We were really thinking the way in which hearing aids needs to be provided to without the need of having a specialist involved in that process. We looked at how to conduct a hearing assessment, which we've been experts in for the last 7 years, and put that on a smartphone. You can buy one of our Lexi Hearing devices off the shelf in about 14,500 doors across the US. You can take it home, download our app, take this hearing assessment, and then we will automatically configure your hearing aid using analytics and AI to your hearing profile.
The company was founded in 2016, but by 2022, your company was one of the fastest growing in Africa. Explain why you've seen that sort of growth and that success.
It's really stemmed around, I think, our innovative culture and us wanting to change the status quo. Typically, hearing aids cost in excess of $5,000, and we said we needed to change that. We've been growing triple-digit figures year on year for the last 5 years. But I think the biggest shift in momentum for us in our figures has been this real tipping point when this OTC legislation passed, when our business 10x overnight. I remember we went from selling, a couple of hundred hearing aids a month to selling tens of thousands of hearing aids a month in a matter of a week. And we are set this year to sell more than 100,000 pairs of hearing aids in the US and grow that by much as 5x next year in the US market alone. And that is without expanding into any of the new markets.
Can you explain further why you haven't expanded more rapidly in South Africa and the African continent as opposed to here in the US?
There's very specific legislation that passed in the US allowing us to distribute these products over the counter. Some of these legislations have not made it to some of the African countries, specifically like South Africa. We anticipate this to be a matter of time when these legislations and the proof of the success thereof moves into the developing world. But unfortunately today in South Africa this has not happened yet, and that's why our devices are not available in South Africa today.
Nick, is the company looking to expand into other markets, and what needs to happen to enable that expansion in other regions and other countries?
We are constantly evaluating new markets, specifically with new regulations coming online, and as well as what the target population look like. So if you think about aging world populations like the UK and Japan, those markets are always great markets to scale into, specifically due to the unmet need they currently are experiencing.
Take us through your vision for the company for the next decade and the end goal.
We'll continue to innovate. We'll continue to keep on pushing the boundaries, changing people's lives on a daily basis. We want to make sure that the education stays top of mind for our consumers and people that use our devices on a daily basis. And then I think new partnerships and making sure that we stay ahead with our platform and as well as with our product innovation to make sure that we have the best product that people can get at the most affordable price point.
That does it for us here on Marketplace Africa. Remember, you can keep up with us on social media and online as well. I'm Zain Asher. I'll see you next time in the Marketplace.
Don't look down. I'm Richard Quest at the World Economic Forum in Davos. This month, Europe looks to dig its way out of the economic doldrums. We'll hear from some of the biggest names in banking across the continent. Also, the head of IKEA tells us how to cut prices in the age of inflation. That's all ahead on Marketplace Europe.
A warm welcome to a cold Davos. There's a sort of general agreement here at WEF that 2024's economic growth, it won't be a banner year, gangbusters, or anything like it. It'll be just moderate and probably slower than expected. And that's particularly so in the case of Europe, which means if you're looking for really good gains, Europe may not be the best place to be.
Behind the glitzy veneer of the World Economic Forum, all is not well with the European economy. While the celebrities, snowboarders and CEOs are gathered here as usual, the talk behind the scenes is somewhat less glamorous. Europe's economy's been plodding along in a somewhat uninspiring fashion, with growth at close to zero. And even if Europe has avoided an outright recession in 2023, the analysis says the continent is stagnating. The International Monetary Fund predicts the euro area will once again lag the United States and other advanced economies in terms of GDP growth this year. And its core economic problems aren't going away. The wars in Ukraine and the Middle East continue to put upward pressure on energy prices. And economists say there's still some way to go to bring down the last mile of inflation. Here in Davos, the top bankers can sense the caution. The head of JP Morgan in Europe and the Middle East believes companies seem reluctant to make deals at the moment.
If I start with investment banking, which is, I co-head global investment banking, the fee pool in investment banking has basically shrunk to a near decade low. I mean, typically the fee pool for all banks is around $80 billion or thereabouts. Last year it was $66.5 billion.
Why is that?
And it's a combination of factors. First of all, the era of cheap money is gone. So, that abundance of deal flow, which we saw in 2021. 2021, the fee pool was $135 billion. So that was the amount of activity the market saw. So the cheap money is over. And there's a bit of uncertainty and the confidence is lacking. So I would say generally, there is a desire to do deals, but people are pausing to just kind of, take a view.
What will it take to get that desire into execution?
Geopolitical certainty.
Oh, well, good luck on that. We might as well finish the interview now, frankly.
One of the biggest uncertainties of them all was hanging over this year's Davos. As events got underway, so did the US presidential primaries, with Donald Trump securing victory in Iowa, as he once again seeks the Republican nomination. European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde has said that Mr. Trump winning re-election would pose a clear threat to Europe, whether through trade tariffs or his stance on climate change or indeed his commitment to NATO. The vice chair of BlackRock says a second Trump presidency could also shake Europe out of its stupor.
It may also be the wake-up call that Europe needs, and I think Christine would probably agree with that, in a sense it's perhaps the jolt that kind of wakes up Europe to say we have to find a way to become more sovereign in a sense and less dependent, whether it's on China or indeed on the United States. So I think it can be both. It is a threat, it is something that worries people to a great extent, but it can also be perhaps a wake-up call.
The 10,000-foot view may seem daunting. The Bank of France governor believes things in Europe are moving in the right direction. While times may have been rocky, there is still the chance to turn crisis into opportunity.
If I had a message for all our European governments, including the French one, we are probably coming out of the economic emergency. Take COVID, inflation, bottlenecks, etc. We are, when I look at the cyclical situation, in a better situation. Disinflation and slowing down our activity, but without recession. It's one reason more coming out of the short term and addressing all the long-term challenges we have in France and in Europe. Over-indebtedness, full employment and, yes, innovation.
More from Davos in just a moment. First, the business agenda for the month ahead in your Marketplace Minute. We'll get earnings from GlaxoSmithKline on January the 31st. This month, the company said it would buy the makers of an asthma drug, Aeolos Bio, a deal worth more than $1 billion. February is launch time for the continent's biggest Formula One teams. Sauber, Aston Martin and Ferrari are amongst those set to unveil their new cars for the 2024 season, which begins in Bahrain at the end of the month. On February the 13th, energy ministers head to Paris for a summit of the IEA. These ministerial talks are held every 2 years by the International Energy Agency. The group was founded in the wake of the 1973 oil crisis. And later that week, the Munich Security Conference begins in Germany. The wars in Ukraine and the Middle East will be on the agenda, with hundreds of policymakers expected to attend. That's the Marketplace Minute. Davos might seem a funny place to talk about inflation. Here in the land of the super rich, a steak can cost up to $150. A round of drinks, good drinks at that, even more. Here in Switzerland, inflation is now starting to stabilise around 2%, which is all very good because it means prices are now a lot more certain. Which is even more interesting that one major retailer has decided to start cutting prices. It's all part of an effort to stimulate demand. IKEA, the Swedish furniture giant, says that even as inflation lingers in Europe, it wants to cut prices across all markets.
It's interesting right now because we have, of course, inflation in the customer end, but we have massive deflation upstream. So right now we are lowering prices more than we ever done.
This is more than a one-off discount. IKEA said it wanted to make affordability a major part of its mission last year. Now looking to cut manufacturing costs and pass the savings on to the consumer. The goal is to attract as many different kinds of customers as possible. For the head of the parent company, it's a strategy that makes sense.
This is not rocket science, really. When we lower our prices, in particular when we are in times now when people have less money in their pockets, interest rates up and so forth, last 6-8 months have been definitely slower than we ever seen. In these days, normally companies like IKEA benefit from customers from maybe higher end levels comes to us. So we're growing customer, we're growing market share, and we're actually growing quantity.
The ability to affect market share, customer amounts by pricing is crucial.
It is, and it works. So the commercial principles still work. And then again, you know, we are still in recuperation of the pandemic, so we are learning a lot. But the interesting life at home is big, and as we speak, we are lowering prices and driving quantity.
New stores are a big part of IKEA's strategy, with smaller shops opening in city centres like Copenhagen, Madrid and soon in London. Borodin hopes they'll appeal to new markets and make people think differently about the brand. How difficult will it be to get to change people's mindset as to, I'm just popping into IKEA to get a whatever it might be, or for a birthday present or whatever. Whereas people always think of it as an afternoon out of town, and you better and come home with a sofa.
No, I think it's a very good question. And in our first experiments, we went too far with some of our changes of the concept. We created free flows and all sorts of things. And our customers said, no, we want it to be IKEA. We want the meatballs. We want the steered flow. But obviously, people living in the city wouldn't carry home a clip-on sofa. So, it's like smaller items for takeaway. And then you go to the big stores when you need the big stuff.
One unexpected headwind for IKEA is the ongoing situation in the Red Sea. Ships have come under attack from militants backed by Iran, and tensions in the Middle East have escalated. As cargo carriers take evasive action, IKEA last month said it was expecting delays and possible constraints on availability. Today, Broden thinks that major problems can be avoided.
If I compare to the challenges we had during peak pandemic, that really disrupted our supply chain. We had massive issues with stock and so forth. But today we don't experience any disturbances on our stocks or availability or such.
And you're not expecting to?
Well, who knows in this ever-changing world. But at the moment, the extra 10 days or so, when you look at basically where we are in our capacity and fulfillment, we don't foresee that at the moment.
The supply chain for IKEA is what? I mean, how complex is it?
Well, how long time do we have now? But listen, we have an integrated supply chain. We develop our own products, right? So we standardize and automate in industry, and we have fewer suppliers than many would think. It's about, I would say, less than 1,000 main suppliers. They are more local and regional than people would think as well. But ultimately, we build big volumes. So we're building on economy of scale, and that's the way we build in sustainability and prices and whatnot.
And that is our report for Marketplace Europe. I'm Richard Quest in Davos. You can read more, of course, at cnn.com/MPE. Whatever you're up to in the business of Europe, I hope it's profitable.
Hello and welcome to our viewers joining us here in the United States and all around the world. I'm Linda Kincaid. Welcome to CNN Newsroom. Coming up, concerns that the United Nations won't be able to carry out critical relief work as nations cut funding following stunning allegations about some workers in Gaza. US President Joe Biden hits the campaign trail in South Carolina telling voters why he expects to defeat Republican frontrunner Donald Trump. And the mother of convicted Michigan school shooter is on trial, raising questions about parents' responsibility for their children's actions.
Live from Atlanta, this is CNN Newsroom with Linda Kincaid.
The head of the UN agency helping Palestinian refugees in Gaza says the group might have to end operations there. These 9 countries paused funding for the UN Relief and Works Agency, known as UNRWA, after accusations by Israel that a handful of their workers were involved in the October 7th Hamas attack. UNRWA fired 9 accused staffers and launched an investigation. The UN says 1 accused staffer has died and the identities of 2 others are being verified. The UN Secretary General is asking that countries continue to fund that agency, saying the abhorrent alleged acts of these staff members must have consequences. But the tens of thousands of men and women who work for UNRWA should not be penalized. The dire needs of the desperate populations they serve must be met. 2 million civilians in Gaza rely on that aid from UNRWA, and those needs are growing. As Israel continues its military operation in Khan Yunis, families are evacuating, struggling to find a safe haven. Besides hunger, fierce rain and cold weather are making their escape even more miserable. And further north in Gaza City, Palestinians rushed to grab sacks of flour that were delivered Saturday. The UN warned this week that parts of the territory are facing famine, and residents say the aid isn't reaching everyone.
Today, I came to get flour, and I couldn't get any. Some people got 3 bags of flour, and some got 4, and I didn't get any. I have 3 children, and I don't know how to feed them. God help us.
Only the young men can take sacks of flour, but the elderly can't. The children, the orphans, and the mothers of orphans, only the strong young men can take a share, but the orphans don't have shares at all.
Well, Palestinian officials say hospitals in Khan Yunis are under siege by Israeli troops. According to the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health, the Nazar Medical Complex is running out of all sorts of medication and blood for transfusions, a shortage that the ministry spokesperson calls severe and dangerous. Doctors Without Borders says the hospital's vital medical services have collapsed. CNN's Paula Hancock joins us live from Abu Dhabi with more on the UNRWA controversy. Good to have you with us, Paula. So 8 countries have stopped funding this agency because of these accusations against the 12 workers. Israel, of course, has long accused that agency of colluding with Hamas. So what does this mean for the people of Gaza who rely on that agency and for the 13,000 people employed by it in Gaza?
Well, Linda, this is the biggest group that is giving out humanitarian aid in Gaza at this point. Without UNRWA, the situation would be even more dire. We're hearing from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying that there's about 2 million people that rely on the aid that is brought in by UNRWA itself. Also pointing out that the funding they have at this point won't last through February, so through next month. Now, it's clear to see the need for humanitarian aid is desperate. Many leaders around the world have been calling for more aid to be brought in and to be given to those who need it most. Of course, the technicalities and the logistics of trying to reach those who need aid are very challenging indeed. Now, we don't know the exact accusations that Israel has made. They have not made them public. They have given those allegations to the US and to UNRWA itself. And they were of the nature that UNRWA immediately did act and fired 9 of its workers and said that there would be an investigation that would undergo immediately. But the Secretary General and also the Chief of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, have said that it is shocking that countries have decided to withhold aiding temporarily and funding to UNRWA as the situation is so desperate. Philippe Lazzarini in a statement saying, quote, It would be immensely irresponsible to sanction an agency and an entire community it serves because of allegations of criminal acts against some individuals, especially at a time of war, displacement and political crises in the region. We have heard concerns by UN officials that Gaza is looming at a possible famine for many of the people that simply do not have enough to eat, enough to drink or any kind of shelter. Now, we've heard from other countries as well, Ireland and Norway, for example, who said that they will not be withholding funding at this point because the need is so acute.
And Paula, of course, the Israel Prime Minister has criticised protests by families of hostages held in Gaza, calling them useless, clearly feeling the pressure, and is now calling on Qatar to use its leverage with Hamas. Explain what he said.
Well, this really started with an alleged leaked audio from the Israeli Prime Minister last week, which was aired on Tuesday on Israeli television, where he was criticising Qatar as not doing enough. And this weekend, he's really doubled down on that message, saying that I'm not taking back one word that I said. Let's listen to the Prime Minister.
Qatar hosts the leaders of Hamas. It also funds Hamas. It has leverage over Hamas. Qatar committed to make sure that the medication will reach the districts of Hamas to our hostages, and Qatar said that it can help bring them back. So, therefore, to put pressure on them, they position themselves as mediators. So please, go right ahead and prove it. Let them be so good as to bring back our hostages.
Now, when it comes to a potential hostage deal, we know that the CIA director, Bill Burns, is going to be meeting in the coming days with his counterparts of Israel and Egypt, talking about a potential deal which is likely to include what it included back in November, which is a cessation of hostilities for a certain amount of time in order for hostages to be released. Linda.
All right, Paula Hancock staying across all those developments from Abu Dhabi. Thanks very much. With new rare footage of blindfolded Palestinian detainees being held by Israeli authorities has been filmed by our CNN team. Jeremy Diamond reports.
Well, we were in southern Israel on Saturday morning near the border with Gaza when we spotted more than 24 men sitting or kneeling on the cold, wet ground, Israeli soldiers standing guard near them. Now, we now know that those men were Palestinians who were arrested by the Israeli military inside of Gaza and brought to Israel for questioning. Now, these men were blindfolded, they were barefoot, and if you look in this video, you can see their hands are tied behind their backs, and all they're wearing are these disposable white coveralls. Now, it's important to keep in mind that it was about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, and quite rainy when we filmed this video. And the men in this video seem to be physically exhausted. You can see them kind of swaying around, their heads bobbing as they seem to be falling asleep. One man was actually lying on the ground before an Israeli soldier came to rouse him and prop him up. Now, the Israeli military, for its part, said, quote, "The individuals shown on camera are suspected of terrorist activity and were arrested in Gaza and transferred to Israel for further interrogation. Relevant suspects are taken for further questioning within Israel. Individuals who are found not to be taking part in terrorist activities are released back into Gaza as soon as possible." Now, the Israeli military also addressed the condition in which we found these Palestinian detainees. They said that they were wearing these white coveralls because they had been stripped and searched to ensure that neither they nor their clothing had any explosive devices or weapons on them. And they said that they were about to be placed on a heated bus and taken to a detention facility where they would be provided with actual clothing. Now, we weren't able to verify exactly how long these men were sitting outside in the cold because an Israeli soldier came to us and directed us once he saw we were filming to leave the premises. Now, as it relates to this claim by Israel that these men are suspected of terrorist activity, it's important to note that while this is the first time that we have actually been able to directly document the detention of these Palestinian men from Gaza, there has been a lot of footage circulating from Gaza of Palestinian men being detained, and in many cases, those men actually turn out to be civilians. They are spotted by their relatives or their friends as civilians. And in December, we actually spoke with 10 Palestinian men and boys who had been detained by the Israeli military, held for 5 days, and ultimately released without charge. Now, these men and boys, all of them had swollen wrists, some of them bruises on their wrists from having their hands tied behind their backs for 5 days. Now, the Israeli military, for its part, maintains that it treats all of these detainees in accordance with international law. Jeremy Diamond, CNN, Tel Aviv.
Here in the U.S., President Joe Biden is taking shots at his main Republican rival, former President Donald Trump, as he campaigns in South Carolina. Mr. Biden is vowing to put tougher immigration measures in place, including the ability to shut down the U.S.-Mexico border as he tries to counter Trump's attacks. He's also working to energize black voters in the state, a group that helped him win the White House in 2020.
You're the reason I am president. You're the reason Kamala Harris is historic vice president. And you're the reason Donald Trump is a defeated former president. You're the reason Donald Trump is a loser. And you're the reason we're going to win and beat him again.
CNN's Priscilla Alvarez is traveling with the president and has more.
President Joe Biden drew a sharp contrast from former President Donald Trump here in South Carolina on Saturday in what was a preview of his general election arguments, casting the former president as, quote, defeated and a loser. President Biden also making the case that Trump is only thinking about himself and not the country, saying, quote, what's good for America is bad for him politically. But the president also spent time making connections with what his administration has done on a range of issues to what communities are seeing on a day-to-day basis, be it investments in HBCUs, driving down insulin costs, and also student loan debt relief, which earned applause in the audience. But notably, the president also weighing in on border security and putting his support behind a border deal that Senate negotiators have been working on for weeks, saying that if given the authority, he would shut down the border and do it quickly.
If that bill were the law today, I'd shut down the border right now and fix it quickly. A bipartisan bill would be good for America and help fix our broken immigration system.
Now, as he has faced in other remarks in the last few days and weeks, there were also protesters in the audience calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. They were escorted out, and President Biden did not engage with them, but it was yet another example of the fractures within the coalition that the president is having to navigate. But the bottom line here was that he needs South Carolina. It's a state that he has credited for turning the tide in 2020, and it is one that's going to have its primary next week. It'll be the first after the Democratic National Committee overhauled the schedule with President Biden's support. The president reflecting on that. And while this is not a competitive primary, it will be a test of his standing with black voters, a key constituency to clinch that win in November. Priscilla Alvarez, CNN, South Carolina.
Also in South Carolina is Nikki Haley, who's mounting a month-long stand against Donald Trump before the Republican primary February 24th. Haley's attacks on Trump have escalated recently after she largely avoided conflict with the former president for nearly a year. Her campaign is getting a boost by Trump's legal battles and heavy investments from political networks linked to people like billionaire Charles Koch. She is facing an uphill battle, but the former South Carolina governor is refusing to step aside.
Only 2 states have voted. There are 48 more that have to vote. No matter what Donald Trump thinks, he can't bully his way to the White House. It's not going to work. And after he did that, we raised another $1.4 million. So Donald, keep them coming because it's great.
Well, Donald Trump is continuing to stoke fears over immigration while campaigning in Nevada. The presidential candidate says there is, quote, a 100% chance that the influx of migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border will lead to a terrorist attack. At a Las Vegas rally on Saturday, Trump broadly called migrants criminals and rapists and said he opposed bipartisan immigration negotiations in Congress. Instead, he says that when he's president, he'll send reinforcements to the southern border.
We have no choice. Within moments of my inauguration, we will begin the largest domestic deportation operation in American history. No choice.
Well, Russia goes on a widespread attack in Ukraine, but heavy guns on the defenders' side often stay silent, and it's not by choice. We'll explain next. Plus, French activists aren't willing to endure what the U.S. went through when America's highest court overturned Roe v. Wade. How they're trying to make their rights permanent and unimpeachable next. Ukrainian officials say Russian troops have gone on the offensive across much of the front line. They gave a blunt assessment of the battleground situation in multiple news statements and social media posts. They say Russia is trying to extend its gains in the northeast, where it recently captured one village about 100 kilometers east of Kharkiv. Further south, the areas near Bakhmut that Ukraine recaptured last fall are also under pressure. While Russia is trying to win back the small pockets of territory that Ukraine captured during its counteroffensive in the Zaporizhia region last year. Ukraine is forced to play defense partly because the Western military aid is drying up. Tens of billions of dollars in aid is stalled by internal political disputes in the US and the EU. As Fred Pleitgen reports, Ukrainians are running short of ammunition just as Russia's military machine goes into overdrive.
Artillery is key as Ukrainian forces try to hold off massive Russian assaults on the Eastern Front. But Kiev's ammo shortages are getting worse by the day. This U.S.-provided M109 Paladin howitzer near Bakhmut is often silent because they don't have enough shells to target the Russians, the commander tells me. We cannot fulfill our tasks 100%, he says, although we really want to. My crew and other crews are just waiting for it and are ready to work around the clock. But it gets even worse. Finally, resupply does arrive, but it's only 4 rounds. And this type of ammo won't hurt the Russians much.
This really illustrates the shortages that Ukrainians have to deal with. 4 rounds, that's all they're going to get right now. And by the way, they're not even explosive rounds, they're smoke rounds.
These shells will barely explode on impact. It's almost like firing cannonballs in medieval times. But the commander says sometimes it's all they can do. Every shell that is suitable for the Paladin we use, he says. It's better than no shells. The Russians face no such shortages in this area. Ukrainian military intelligence believes Russia produced around 2 million rounds last year and acquired around 1 million from North Korea. Massive barrages have laid waste to Bakhmut and much of the surrounding area. At the headquarters of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade's Artillery Division, the frustration is palpable. From their drones, they can see the Russians gather to continue their assaults on Ukrainian positions, but they often can't take them out because they need to conserve ammunition, the commander tells me. The ratio is about 10-to-1, he says. Ammunition is very important to us. Russia is a country that produces ammo. They have strategic reserves. Yes, they use old Soviet systems, but